The mouse from registration. That's what they called her, whispered it when they thought she couldn't hear. Dr. Hargrove had announced it in the cafeteria on her first day, a bet with 2 residents that the new hire would quit within a week, maybe less. She'd been restocking supply carts in Trauma Bay 3 when the laughter echoed down the corridor. The room went dead silent when she'd walked past them with an empty cart, eyes fixed on inventory sheets, shoulders rounded inward like she was trying to occupy less space. Nobody said it to her face. That was the calculation they all made, looking at the quiet woman with the pulled-back auburn hair and the hands that moved with strange, purposeful efficiency. She was beneath notice. She was exactly as she'd intended to be. Megan O'Brien had spent 18 years disappearing. First as a combat medic for the Navy, then as something darker, a senior chief petty officer attached to units that didn't officially exist, operations that required her name scrubbed from every record, her face removed from every photograph. Kandahar. Fallujah. Forward operating bases with names she couldn't speak even now. She'd extracted 12 wounded under fire on a Tuesday in Helmand Province, her fingers working while explosions walked their way across the courtyard behind her. She'd held a young Marine's intestines in her hands while calling for medevac, her voice steady as a surgical laser. She'd done things that earned medals she couldn't display, commendations filed in safes behind doors that required retinal scans. And then she'd walked away. Disappeared. Became nobody. Sacred Heart Hospital in Norfolk gave her a fresh identity and a quiet corner. She wore scrubs 2 sizes too large, the better to hide the muscle memory of her body, the things she could do that no civilian nurse should be able to do. Her auburn hair stayed pulled into a severe bun. She wore minimal makeup. She kept her eyes on the work in front of her, the supply carts, the inventory sheets, the mechanical rhythm of restocking that required no conversation, no connection, no one asking her name. The jacket she hung in her locker had a faded unit patch sewn inside the lining. She touched it once each shift, her fingers finding the fabric like a compass needle finding north. A small reminder of who she'd been. A private prayer that she'd stay invisible. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song above her. The smell of antiseptic mixed with floor wax, that clinical brightness that existed nowhere else in the world. Her hands, scarred across the knuckles in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, cross-hatched white lines from shrapnel in Kandahar, moved across the crash cart, positioning the needle decompression kit at exact arm's length from where a physician would stand during an emergency. Her fingers knew the geometry of trauma without thinking. They'd learned it in sand and dust and screaming. Dr. Marcus Hargrove saw her during her second shift. He was standing in Trauma Bay 3 at 6:51 a.m., coffee in hand, watching the new nurse work with an intensity that made his jaw tighten. She was reorganizing the emergency equipment with a kind of precision he'd never seen in a hospital setting before. Not faster. Just cleaner. More logical. The crash cart was arranged like she could navigate it in the dark. The oxygen sources were positioned for rapid deployment. The medication drawer was organized by frequency of use, not alphabetically like hospital protocol dictated. Hargrove had been committing insurance fraud at Sacred Heart for 18 months. Phantom procedures. Inflated equipment orders. False diagnostic codes that justified procedures that never happened. He'd made $847,000 in the last fiscal year alone, money that had paid for his daughter's tuition at Georgetown and a vacation home in Montauk. The scheme was perfect because he was a director. He had access. He had authority. He had 3 board members who'd received generous donations to their favorite charities and a hospital CEO who understood that questions were bad for everyone's bottom line. But this new nurse. This woman moving through the ER like she was reading a map only she could see. There was something about her competence that sent a cold current through his chest. Competent people noticed things. Competent people asked questions. Competent people became problems. "You," he called out, his voice the kind of lazy command that expected immediate obedience. "What's your name again?" She turned. The faintest pause. "Megan, doctor." Her voice was quiet. Measured. No inflection. no personality. Exactly what he wanted to hear. He watched her hand, scarred, he noticed now, in a way that suggested violence or trauma, move back to the defibrillator pad she'd been organizing. From registration, right? That's what staffing told me. Yes, doctor. He smiled. The kind of smile that wasn't kind. Well, Megan from registration, try not to reorganize things that don't need reorganizing. We have standards around here. She didn't respond. Didn't nod. Didn't show the flinch he was hoping for. She simply turned back to the crash cart and continued her work with the same mechanical precision. The absence of reaction irritated him more than any comeback could have. He wanted her to show something. Fear, resentment, discomfort. Something he could use. But Megan O'Brien had learned long ago that reactions were luxury items she couldn't afford. She'd watched senior officers deliberately humiliate privates to establish dominance. She'd seen what happened when people showed their fear. So she showed nothing. Her hands kept moving. Her breath stayed steady. And inside her jacket, hidden in the lining, her faded unit patch felt like an anchor. The next shift brought chaos. A Navy SEAL arrived in the ER at 2:34 a.m. with shrapnel wounds across his left shoulder and neck. His name was Petty Officer First Class Raymond Torres, and he'd been shot with a fragment of IED shrapnel that the ER resident, a med school graduate named Chen who'd never treated combat trauma in his life, was preparing to suture with what looked like a fishing technique. Megan saw it immediately. The angle was wrong. The suture spacing was wrong. The doctor was going to trap infection inside that wound, and Torres was going to develop necrotizing fasciitis that would eat through his shoulder and into his chest cavity within 72 hours. She moved without thinking, the weight of her rank and her training overwhelming the careful camouflage she'd built around herself. "Excuse me, doctor." Her voice was still quiet. Still deferential. But there was something beneath it now. Something that made Chen's hands pause. The angle on that entry wound is posterior superior. The fascia is compromised. You'll want to extend the suture pattern to ensure you're not leaving dead space. Chen stared at her. "You're a..." Megan's worked trauma before, Dr. Hargrove said from the doorway, his voice carrying a sharp note of irritation. He'd followed her, watching. Waiting for her to make a mistake. Instead she'd just made herself more dangerous. Let her observe, doctor. New experience. But Megan wasn't observing. Her hands moved as Chen stepped back, her fingers moving with muscle memory that lived in her bones. The 4.0 suture she pulled from the tray felt like an extension of her arm. She'd done this in field hospitals under mortar fire. She'd closed wounds in darkness, working by touch alone. She knew the exact tension needed to bring flesh together without strangling it. She knew where the nerves ran and where the blood vessels waited. She worked with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd learned these techniques in the worst possible classroom. 3 minutes. Her hands moved through suture placement like she was playing a composition only she could hear. The spacing was perfect. The depth was consistent. The result was a closure that would leave minimal scarring and maximum structural integrity. Torres watched her while she worked, his eyes tracking her hands with the intensity of someone recognizing something precious and rare. "That's a combat medic's pattern," he whispered when she finished. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen that specific technique only a handful of times in his life. "I saw that in Helmand Province. With a surgeon attached to Task Force 121. Megan tied off the final suture. She didn't look at him. She didn't answer. She simply smiled, the smallest movement, barely visible, and stepped back from the bed with the crash cart between them. Torres watched her leave. His eye stayed on the doorway long after she'd disappeared into the corridor, his wounded shoulder forgotten, his mind working through something that didn't quite make sense but felt true anyway. The fingerprints on those sutures. The speed. The confidence of someone who'd sewn wounded flesh together while listening to the sound of incoming fire. Dr. Hargrove watched Megan walk past him in the hallway outside the bay, her shoulders rounded again, her head down, the brief moment of authority already packed away like classified documents. But he'd seen it. For 90 seconds, she'd been someone else entirely. And that someone else was absolutely a threat to everything he'd built. What happened in the next 24 hours would begin to explain why. The bet was announced in the nurse's station at 6:53 a.m. during morning rounds, while Megan restocked the crash cart with 14-gauge angiocath needles and trauma shears. Dr. Hargrove's voice carried from the coffee maker, loud enough to carry, calculated to land. $20 says the mouse from registration doesn't make it through the week. Anyone want to cover? 3 residents laughed. One of them actually laughed. Megan's jaw tightened. Her hands kept moving. Gauze. Gloves. Saline flushes in perfect rows. The muscles in her neck went rigid, but her breathing stayed even, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she'd learned to breathe under mortar fire when panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She was invisible. That was the agreement with herself. Stay small. Stay quiet. Stay gone. The residents drifted past her cart without acknowledgement, and she let them. That was easier. But Hargrove noticed the tension in her shoulders. He noticed everything about her now, the precise economy of her movements, the way she anticipated what equipment would be needed before doctors asked, the unsettling competence of someone who had no business being that skilled at a hospital registration nurse's wage. He saw threat. She saw only work. 2 days later, she sat alone in the cafeteria with a tray of soup and saltine crackers, tablet balanced against a water glass, reviewing the blood pressure trends on a post-op cardiac patient who'd been in the ER the week before. The fluorescent overhead lights cast everything in clinical white. Her scrubs, the ones with the small bloodstains she couldn't quite get out, stuck to her arms where she'd helped transfer a trauma patient. She was thinking about electrolyte balance, not about the footsteps approaching from her left side. Hargrove walked past her table. Slowed. Then his elbow came up, swift and casual as a gesture in conversation, and knocked the tray from the table. The bowl tumbled. Soup, dark brown, still steaming, splashed across her legs, her scrubs, the floor in a violent scatter. Crackers exploded into fragments. The tablet clattered edge first but stayed intact, screened down on the tile. Oops. His voice was silk over broken glass. Maybe you should eat in the break room, sweetheart. The big kids' table is full. His residents, the ones standing by the salad bar, the ones pretending not to watch, they erupted. Real laughter. The kind that made the room feel smaller. Megan stood slowly. Deliberately. She felt the soup cooling against her skin, felt the weight of every eye that had suddenly turned toward her. Her chest was tight. Her vision had narrowed to a single point, Hargrove's face, his smile that didn't reach his eyes, the satisfaction sitting there like oil on water. She took one measured breath. One tear escaped down her cheek. Just one. It surprised her. She wasn't crying, crying would have meant surrender. This was something else. A physical response she didn't authorize, something her body released without permission. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, her eyes never leaving his face. Not wavering. Not breaking. Meeting him exactly where he was. When she spoke, her voice was like still water, that kind of calm that comes from the bottom of deep places where no light reaches. I've carried heavier things than your insecurity, doctor. Each word landed separate and distinct. A statement of fact. No anger. No tremor. Just the truth, delivered without inflection or apology. The laughter died. It stopped like someone had cut the audio track. Hargrove's smile froze. His residents exchanged glances. He turned away, but his shoulders were rigid now, and she watched him move toward the exit with the careful precision of someone who'd been struck and was trying to hide the impact. The cafeteria returned to its ambient noise, scraping chairs, clinking silverware, the low murmur of hospital conversations, but something had shifted. Something had cracked. Megan knelt on the floor. She gathered every soggy cracker fragment, every page of her tablet, soup dripping from her elbows onto the tile. A custodian appeared with a mop, tried to help, but she waved him off. "I've got it." Her hands were steady. Her voice was steady. That was what mattered. The control. The refusal to break. The chart throwing came that afternoon, in the ER hallway outside Trauma Bay 2. Hargrove emerged from the trauma bay where she'd been assisting, papers flying from his hands like startled birds. The patient file scattered across the floor, pages spinning, landing in a half-circle around her feet. For a moment, the hallway felt like a photograph. Everything stopped. "Pick that up, sweetheart." His voice was quiet now, which was worse somehow. Quiet meant he'd thought about it. Quiet meant calculation. That's what nurses do. Clean up messes. Megan looked at the scattered papers. She could have ignored him. Could have reported him. Could have let the anger she felt like a stone in her chest crack her open and splinter. Instead, she knelt. She gathered every single page in perfect order, the way she'd been trained to organize intelligence reports, the way she'd managed supply chains for field hospitals where order was the difference between saving lives and watching them slip away. She stood. She handed him the file, intact, organized, professional. "Yes, doctor. We do." Her voice never wavered. It came out smooth and light, the voice of someone who had already decided not to fight back. The voice of someone who had decided to vanish. But her hand shook for 3 seconds after he walked away. Just 3. She was pressing them flat against her thighs when the first alarm screamed through the hospital's east wing. The gas leak alarm cut through everything at 9:16 a.m. on Tuesday morning, a sound like an air raid siren, mechanical and relentless, echoing from the corridor that led to the respiratory ward. Staff moved toward exits. Protocol dictated evacuation. Megan was standing in the hallway with a medication cart when the first scream cut through the alarm, a patient's voice, raw and panicked, choking on air that had turned into poison. Her feet moved before her mind caught up. The chemical smell hit her nostrils, propane and sulfur, the same mixture as the Kandahar compound explosion, the same smell that had been in her lungs for 3 days afterward, embedded in her clothing, her hair, her dreams. Her body recognized it before her conscious mind did. Her pupils dilated. Her breathing shifted to combat rhythm. The part of her that had been deferential, invisible, broken, it stepped back. Something else stepped forward. She found the first patient in room 304, a woman in her 60s, lips starting to cyanose, breathing in shallow gasps. Megan opened the window, pulled her into the hallway, positioned her sitting upright. "Breathe slow. In through your nose. You're going to be okay." Room 306 had a man in post-op recovery, already confused from anesthesia and now panicking from lack of oxygen. She moved him to the stairwell, got him sitting with his head between his knees. "Slow breaths. The alarm will stop. You're safe." Room 310 was different. The Navy SEAL from 2 days ago, the one with the shrapnel wounds, the one whose sutures she'd closed with the exact tension that the combat medic in her would have used, the one who'd watched her hands and whispered recognition she'd pretended not to hear, he was gasping in his bed, his chest not moving on the left side. His lips were the color of slate. His eyes were starting to roll. Tension pneumothorax. His lung had collapsed. Without intervention, he had minutes. Maybe less. Megan grabbed the needle decompression kit from the crash cart, the equipment cart she'd restocked 300 times, the muscle memory ingrained in muscle fiber. 14-gauge angiocath needle. She positioned him, found the second intercostal space by touch alone, the anatomical landmarks her hands remembered from 12 wounded Marines in the Sanjin Valley, from 3 years of operations in a war that had never made the news. Her hands moved on their own. She drove the catheter home. The hiss of air escaping. Swift and definite. His chest expanded. Color returned to his lips. His breathing deepened, became real. The SEAL's eyes focused on her face. He whispered, That's combat technique. Where'd you learn? She placed 2 fingers on his wrist, checked his pulse, strong, regular, climbing back toward normal. Her voice came out gentle, the voice of a nurse, not a soldier. You're going to be fine. Stay still. She didn't answer the question. She wouldn't. Not yet. Not when staying invisible was all that kept her safe. Dr. Hargrove arrived as the hazmat team cleared the East Wing, moving through the corridors with the mechanical precision of people who'd done this before. He stood in the doorway of room 310, watching Megan step back from the bedside. The SEAL was breathing. Stable. Stable because of the needle decompression, because of the exact procedure that only a combat medic would have executed with that kind of certainty. Security cameras had captured everything. The alarm screamed at 9:08 a.m. Not a code. Not a drill. A full facility evacuation alert that split the East Wing of Sacred Heart into chaos. Fire personnel materialized in the corridors shouting room numbers. Nurses herded confused patients toward the stairwells. The smell hit next, acrid, chemical, wrong, natural gas, deliberately odorless, but this carried something else, something the hospital had added so humans could detect the danger. Most people ran away from that smell. Megan ran toward it. The east corridor emptied in 90 seconds. She moved against the current of evacuation personnel, her badge clipped to her scrubs catching the fluorescent flicker overhead. A fire marshal grabbed her arm near the respiratory unit. Wrong direction, 3 patients in room for 12 can't ambulate. Her voice carried no emotion. Just fact. Room for 15 is on a BiPAP machine. He let go. She kept moving. The gas smell intensified. Acrid. Metallic. The kind of smell that made your throat close. Megan's lungs registered the warning her body had learned to ignore years ago. Pain is information, she thought. This is information about what's happening in for 12. She pushed through the stairwell door. Room for 12 held an elderly woman in respiratory distress, her oxygen saturation monitor screaming at her like a small bird trapped in a cage. Room for 15 held a man in his 60s wheezing against the BiPAP mask, his eyes wide with the particular panic of someone who couldn't breathe and knew it. Room for 13 held a third patient, younger, clutching the side rails of his bed with white knuckles. And then there was the SEAL. He lay in room for 14, the isolation unit, chest rising and falling with that shallow, desperate rhythm that meant one lung had filled with air instead of oxygen. Tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung was compressing his right side, pushing on his heart, killing him slowly in a room full of people who didn't know they were watching someone die. His eyes found hers across the threshold. Recognition flickered there, not because she'd saved him 2 days ago, but because he knew what this looked like. Combat trauma. Blast injury. A lung that would kill him in minutes if nobody moved. Megan assessed in 2 seconds, oxygen masks on the wall, emergency kit on the crash cart, the SEAL's chest wall bare above his hospital gown, the second intercostal space midclavicular line where the needle needed to go. 20 centimeters in on the right side of his sternum. Her hands moved without asking permission. Stay with me, she said to the other 3 patients, already moving toward the SEAL. Keep your masks on. Don't leave this floor. She grabbed the emergency kit. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Her fingers found the correct location on his ribs like she'd practiced it yesterday instead of 3 years ago. The skin here was thin. The needle would go clean. She didn't hesitate. Didn't steady her breathing. Didn't do any of the things civilian nurses do when they're about to perform a procedure they're not technically certified for. Her hands moved like muscle memory. Like they'd done this before. Like they'd done this on combat footage in Kandahar with helicopters waiting and mortars falling 50 meters away. The needle punctured the intercostal muscle. The SEAL's back arched. His eyes watered, but he didn't cry out. She understood then that he'd been expecting this. That something in how she moved had told him she knew exactly what she was doing. The hiss came next. Sharp. Sudden. The sound of air escaping under pressure, of a collapsed lung re-expanding, of the physical act of his body beginning to survive again. The monitor numbers climbed. 74, 78. 82, his breathing deepened. Color returned to his face like someone had turned up a dimmer switch. His eyes found hers and held them for 1 second, not gratitude, not yet. Just recognition between two people who understood what they were looking at. "I'm going on break," Megan said quietly. "Oxygen saturation is stable now." It took him a moment to understand she wasn't actually leaving. She was giving him an explanation for anyone monitoring the hallway. She was covering what had just happened here. She was already thinking about consequences. She checked the other 3 patients. Their oxygen levels were holding. The gas smell was dissipating. She could hear boots on the tile downstairs, fire personnel beginning their sweep. She had maybe 4 minutes before someone found her in this corridor and asked questions about what she'd done. Megan went back to the seal. "That was a medical emergency." "You were coding." "I performed emergency needle decompression using a 14-gauge angiocath. Standard emergency protocol." She spoke like she was reading the procedure manual. Like this was routine. Like her hands hadn't just performed a maneuver that required training she officially didn't have. The SEAL's head moved slightly. A nod. He understood the story. He understood she was giving them both a version of events that wouldn't require deeper explanation. But someone else had seen it all. Dr. Hargrove sat in his office that evening at 7:15 p.m., the hospital quiet now, the evacuation complete, the gas leak contained and documented and already forgotten by most staff. He had a password to the security system that nobody knew he had. He'd installed it personally 3 years ago, told the IT director it was for administrative oversight. The IT director, grateful for a surgery referral Hargrove had provided, had asked no questions. He watched the footage frame by frame. Watched it 3 times. The nurse, the invisible one, the one he'd knocked the lunch tray from the hands of, running toward the gas leak instead of away. Finding a Navy SEAL in respiratory distress. Her hands moving. Not hesitant. Not cautious. Not like someone performing their first needle decompression. Like someone who'd done it dozens of times. The needle went in at exactly the right angle. The hiss of air. His oxygen saturation climbing. Her voice, he unmuted this part, steady as a surgical laser, talking through the procedure like she was teaching it, not learning it. He backed up the footage. Watched her hands again. Textbook. Military textbook. The exact progression taught in combat medic courses at Fort Sam Houston. The efficiency of someone who'd practiced this on training mannequins that bled red water, then on actual humans who bled actual blood. Someone with that training would notice his supply orders. Someone with that skill set would understand that the equipment manifests didn't match what actually arrived on the dock. Someone who'd served in the military would recognize that 40% of his operating equipment was being billed for at 3 times the actual cost, then resold, then billed again to insurance. Someone with combat medic training would become a problem. Dr. Hargrove stopped the footage on her face. That single moment where the SEAL was looking at her with recognition, and she was looking at him like she understood exactly what he was about to say, and she was already calculating how to stop him from saying it. He picked up his phone at 7:41 p.m. First call, board member Patricia Chen, whose surgical referral practice had grown 300% in the last 2 years because of Hargrove's recommendations. She answered on the second ring. "Patricia. We have a situation. New nurse in the ER. Megan O'Brien. Her credentials need to be reviewed. I'm seeing inconsistencies in her paperwork. She performed procedures today that fall outside her scope of practice. We need an outside investigator before this becomes a liability issue." The words hung in the air. Patricia asking questions he answered with carefully chosen phrases. Unauthorized medical procedures. Unverifiable training. Employment history with significant gaps. By the time he hung up, Patricia had already committed to calling 3 board members. Second call, board member Marcus Webb, whose nephew had gotten into Johns Hopkins Medical School after Hargrove wrote a letter of recommendation. Webb owed him. Webb answered like he was expecting this call. Marcus, I need you to arrange an outside credentialing review. HR matter. Confidential. Tuesday morning. Someone who asks hard questions. Third call, a number he'd written down years ago. The previous hospital where Megan's references listed employment. He'd impersonated an HR director when she applied to Sacred Heart, had given himself a fake callback number. Now he called it back, left a voicemail on the dead line that only he could answer. This is Dr. Hargrove at Sacred Heart Hospital in Norfolk. We're investigating misconduct allegations regarding a former employee, Megan O'Brien. She's now employed here. Can you send me documentation of her employment history and any disciplinary records you may have? No one would ever respond. Because that number went nowhere. Because he'd created it himself. Fourth call at 8:02 p.m. Jim Reeves, the security director. His poker buddy. The man whose ex-wife's medical bills Hargrove had helped him negotiate down in exchange for certain favors. Jim. The footage from the gas leak evacuation. I need you to purge it. That nurse performed procedures she's not certified for. Massive liability. The footage is evidence of negligence. It needs to disappear before anyone else sees it. He could hear Jim's hesitation. That's illegal. Document. What's illegal is a nurse performing emergency procedures outside her scope of practice and the hospital not acting. Corrupt the backup. Tell IT there was a server failure. Handle it. Jim handled it. By 8:51 p.m., the footage was gone. Overwritten. Lost in the cloud of the hospital's backup system, corrupted beyond recovery by a man who understood that certain requests came with certain consequences and certain career benefits. By Wednesday morning, an outside investigator named Charles Whitmore sat in the hospital conference room asking about credential verification. By Wednesday afternoon, he was asking Megan about her employment history and why there was a 3-year gap between her last position and Sacred Heart. Personal reasons, Megan said quietly. I took time off. The hospital you listed as your previous employer says they have no record of your employment. I listed them wrong. It was 12 years ago. She was lying. She was lying because the alternative was explaining where she'd actually been for those 3 years, which wasn't something you could put on a job application. Some truths required security clearances to speak aloud. By Thursday afternoon at 2:16 p.m., Jim Reeves handed her a cardboard box and mentioned that the footage from Tuesday had been corrupted during the backup process, so fortunately there's no evidence of whatever happened in that corridor. Insurance won't need to get involved. He was being kind. He was also being clear. Someone had decided this situation needed to disappear, and Jim was the one chosen to make it happen. Megan set the box on the passenger seat of her 2008 Honda Civic. Her scrubs went in first. Then her badge. Then the small items from her locker, the hand sanitizer, the pen with Sacred Heart's logo, the photograph of Danny at his elementary school graduation that she'd taped inside. At the bottom of her locker sat her jacket. The one she'd worn to her first day at Sacred Heart, the one she'd hung on the hook every single day since. She pulled it on. Felt the weight of the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the patch from her first deployment, the patch with the insignia of the unit that had officially declared her dead 3 years ago. She touched it once. Let her fingers rest there for 3 seconds. Then she drove out of Sacred Heart's parking lot at 3:04 p.m. with a termination letter on her dashboard and a career in ashes. Dr. Hargrove waited until the security footage had finished playing before he picked up his office phone. His fingers moved with the precision of a man who had spent 15 years building a system that bent rather than broke. The intercom crackled once. His voice remained steady, conversational, a man ordering coffee, not activating a network. Marcus, it's Hargrove. I need a favor. The board member on the other end of the line owed him $340,000 in referral kickbacks spread across 3 years. The math was simple. Hargrove dialed again. Then again. 2 board members. For phone calls. The message was identical each time. There's a credibility issue with one of our newer RN hires. Personnel matter. Nothing official yet, but her references should probably be scrutinized. He used the word scrutinized deliberately. It meant investigation. It meant doubt. It meant that by the time anyone asked questions, the answers would already be shaped. By Wednesday morning, the references Megan had listed, a clinic director in San Antonio who'd known her for 3 years, a surgical nurse from her previous hospital assignment, had each received calls from a consulting firm claiming to conduct a routine background verification. The calls were professional, courteous, and designed to plant a specific seed. We're noticing some irregularities in her training credentials. Have you ever noticed her performing procedures beyond standard RN scope? The clinic director hesitated. The surgical nurse hesitated. Hesitation was all Hargrove needed. He had activated something far more sophisticated than rumors. He had activated institutional doubt. The outside investigator arrived Thursday morning at 7:02 a.m., before the day shift fully populated the halls. Her name was Dr. Patricia Levin, and she had been hired by Hargrove's contact at the State Nursing Board for precisely $8,500, enough to make the investigation feel thorough, not enough to make it feel biased. She carried a leather portfolio and a demeanor that suggested she was simply doing her job, which made her far more dangerous than any accusation. She requested Megan's personnel file, her training documentation, her procedure logs from the past 2 weeks. She asked to observe Megan during her shift. She watched with the cold attention of someone looking for confirmation of a thesis already decided. At 2:14 p.m., Dr. Levin requested a private meeting with Megan in the hospital's administrative conference room. The room smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and stale air conditioning. Megan sat across from Levin and a human resources representative named David Cortez, whose role was purely procedural. He was here to document the conversation, nothing more. Levin opened her portfolio with a sound like a closing door. Ms. O'Brien, we're conducting a credential review following some concerns raised regarding your training background. During your work here at Sacred Heart, you've performed several procedures that require advanced training. Needle decompression on a trauma patient during the gas leak emergency, for example. Levin's eyes were the color of old steel. That's a Navy combat medic procedure. Civilian RNs are trained to call for a physician when tension pneumothorax presents. You didn't call anyone. You acted with a level of certainty that suggests training beyond what your credentials indicate. Megan's hands rested flat on the table. Her voice came out level, careful, the voice of someone choosing every word. I was responding to a life-threatening emergency. The patient was losing consciousness. Yes, we're aware of your actions during the gas leak. The question is how you knew to perform that specific procedure with that level of speed and precision. Levin leaned forward slightly. Your references mentioned you worked abroad for several years. The dates on your resume appear to have a gap. A gap of approximately 7 years, from 2012 to 2019. You've listed your employment for that period as private contracting. Private contracting for whom, exactly? The room seemed to compress. Cortez was writing something in a notebook. His pen sounded like it was breaking small bones with each stroke. I cannot discuss that period of my employment, Megan said quietly. Cannot, or will not. Cannot. The contract was classified. Levin's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes, a recognition. Classified work meant military. Military work meant the Navy. And military assets didn't become hospital nurses without a reason. I see. Well, that presents a significant problem for us, Ms. O'Brien. Your credentials indicate you completed your nursing degree through a civilian program in 2011. Yet your clinical knowledge exceeds what would be expected from that training alone. The investigative team has concerns about credential irregularities and unauthorized scope of practice. We have documentation of your performing an invasive medical procedure without physician authorization or supervision. Megan didn't move. Didn't blink. Effective immediately, Levin continued, opening an envelope from her portfolio. Your employment at Sacred Heart Hospital is terminated. Your nursing license is being reported to the State Board for investigation. You're being asked to surrender your hospital badge and access credentials. Security will escort you from the building. The words came in a sequence that felt rehearsed, which meant they were. Hargrove had orchestrated this from the moment he decided she was a threat. Not vindictively, professionally. He had simply removed the obstacle from the board. The security director who escorted Megan to her locker was indeed Hargrove's poker buddy. His name was Frank. He avoided her eyes the entire walk. In the locker room, she changed out of her scrubs, pale blue, hospital-issued, a garment that had made her invisible and safe. She placed them in a canvas bag along with her name badge and access card. The faded unit patch that she'd sewn into the lining of her jacket 15 months ago would have to stay there. She couldn't risk removing it. Frank stood by the door, communicating through his silence that this was procedure, nothing personal. At 3:16 p.m., Megan sat at her kitchen table in her small house on Whitmore Avenue. She was still wearing her outer scrubs because she hadn't had the energy to change. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the particular exhaustion of a body that has spent 8 hours in maximum composure. The termination letter was on the table in front of her. The letter from the Board of Nursing was also there, printed from her email 30 minutes ago, informing her that a complaint had been filed regarding credential irregularities and that a full investigation was pending. The house was silent. Afternoon light came through the kitchen window in columns of dust and forgetting. Danny came through the front door at 3:23 p.m., home from school early because of a teacher workday. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw her. His backpack slid from one shoulder. "Mom? Why are you home? Did you take a personal day?" Megan couldn't answer. The question was too simple. A personal day was when you decided to stay home. This wasn't a decision. This was erasure. "Mom." She tried to find the words. How could she explain that the woman who had taught him that honor meant something, that service meant something, had spent 7 years working for a government that would now erase her entirely if it meant protecting classified information? How could she explain that disappearing once for your country, carefully, officially, with documentation that placed you nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, had taught you exactly how easy it was to disappear twice? "They let me go, sweetheart." Her voice sounded like it was coming from another room. "It's okay. I'll find something else." Danny set his backpack on the floor. He was 14 years old, tall enough now that he could almost look directly into her eyes. "Why? You're the best nurse they have. Everyone says so. There was a misunderstanding about my credentials. It's just a procedural thing. It'll get sorted out." The lie felt poisonous in her mouth. She was looking at her son and seeing the moment he understood that the person sitting in front of him was not who she had been 10 minutes ago. Mothers were supposed to be solid. Mothers were supposed to be here. Mothers were not supposed to be ghosts in their own homes. Danny sat down beside her. He didn't hug her or try to comfort her, which somehow made it worse. He just sat there, present, waiting for his mother to remember how to be a person again. The evening came down like a closing fist. Megan opened her laptop and saw the email from the Board of Nursing. She read it twice. An anonymous complaint had been filed. An investigation was pending. Her license was under review. The investigation could take weeks. The investigation could take months. During that time, she couldn't work. Couldn't earn money. Couldn't explain to her son why the woman he'd known his entire life was suddenly unemployable. Outside the kitchen window, Norfolk streetlights flickered on one by one. She could see the hospital from her house if she stood on the porch and looked northwest toward the water. Sacred Heart's main building was just a thin line of light in the dark, visible only because she knew where to look for it. The place where she'd worked for 16 months. The place where she'd saved lives. The place where she'd been visible just long enough to matter. Megan O'Brien, who had carried 12 wounded soldiers across 2 kilometers of open fire. Who had talked a seal through a sucking chest wound with nothing but her voice and her hands. Who had performed a needle decompression in 40 seconds flat while the rest of a hospital evacuated. She closed the laptop. The house went quiet again. Danny was in his room. She could hear the low hum of his laptop fan, the gentle click of keys. He was doing homework. He was continuing. He was moving through the world as if his mother hadn't just been systematically erased from her second civilian life. She pressed her hand against her forehead and felt the edge of something, not a break, but a crease. The kind of crease that happens when a person learns to bend twice and wonders if there's anything left to bend a third time. The silence stretched. The rain that had been threatening all afternoon finally came, hammering against the windows with the sound of 1,000 fingers demanding entry. She didn't move. She simply sat there, still in scrubs, still in the uniform of someone who no longer existed, and listened to Norfolk wash itself clean around her. Exactly 48 hours after the gas leak, a graying man in contractor clothes arrived in the Sacred Heart ER with a gunshot wound bleeding through his left shoulder, and the moment the doors opened, his eyes found her. Megan was assisting the new attending physician, her hand steady on the trauma cart, when the man's voice cracked like thunder across the tile floor. He shouted in Pashto, each word trembling with recognition, "You. The American woman from the compound. The surgeon who would not let me die." His finger shook as he pointed, not at her face, but at the jacket hanging on the wall behind her, the one she'd worn for 18 years, the one with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining so deep no one would ever find it unless they looked. Unless they knew. The patch was visible now because she'd pulled the jacket out that morning, held it in both hands at 3 a.m., and wept for the first time since the firing. The man's eyes locked onto that patch like a drowning swimmer spotting shore. His voice dropped to a whisper, "I recognized you then. I recognize you now. The hands that saved my life. The hands that saved my family." The room didn't move. The attending froze mid-step. 2 nurses stopped their inventory. The cardiac monitor beeped its steady rhythm into a silence so thick you could hear the fluorescent lights buzz and strain overhead. Then Danny O'Brien, 17 years old, wearing a blazer 2 sizes too large because he'd borrowed it from his uncle that morning, stepped forward from where he'd been waiting in the hallway with his mother's forgotten keys. He'd come to return them. He'd come to see if she was okay, if she was coming home. His face was streaked with tears, not from sadness, but from the crushing weight of finally understanding why his mother had been crying at the kitchen table at 3 in the afternoon, why she'd told him to forget about the birthday dinner planned for next week, why she'd whispered that sometimes people had to disappear to keep the people they loved safe. Danny's voice, when it came, was steady and clear and carried the authority of someone who'd inherited his mother's composure, that senior chief petty officer O'Brien, actually. He stepped beside the graying man. And she saved a lot more than one life. The attending physician's face went white. A resident's clipboard clattered to the floor. The trauma nurse who'd been prepping instruments looked from Danny to Megan, and something shifted in her expression, recognition, not of Megan's face, but of the way the boy stood exactly like the woman beside him, the same angle of the shoulders, the same unflinching stare. The hospital director, Richard Paulson, appeared in the doorway then, moving with the purpose of a man who'd spent the last 2 hours on phone calls that had changed his entire understanding of the nurse he'd fired 48 hours ago. Behind him came Commander James Walsh, a Navy SEAL team leader with the kind of presence that made the air pressure change, that made people unconsciously step backward. Walsh moved to the center of the trauma bay, and his voice, when he spoke, carried through every corner of the ER like a radio transmission that couldn't be ignored. Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, United States Navy. I'm here to inform this hospital of her actual service record. He held a tablet, and his thumb moved across the screen as he recited her military history with the precision of someone reading a classified dossier. 2 Bronze Stars for operational excellence. 1 Purple Heart for wounds sustained in combat. 1 Silver Star for leading the extraction of 12 wounded Marines under direct enemy fire in Kandahar Province, Paktia District, when her forward operating base came under coordinated insurgent attack in 2019. He paused. His jaw tightened. A classified operation of such significance that we made the decision to bury her identity, her existence, to protect intelligence assets and ongoing counterterrorism operations. She became invisible by order of JSOC. Not by choice. By necessity. The outside investigator stood frozen. Board member Patricia Chen stepped away from Dr. Hargrove, who had arrived behind the director, pale and trembling, like he carried contagion. Board member Marcus Webb was already on his phone with counsel, his face the color of old ash. Then the FBI agents arrived. Special Agent Catherine Reeves, badge visible on her hip, flanked by 2 colleagues. Behind them came Marcus Chen, the IT director, a Marine Corps veteran with the bearing of someone who'd seen enough injustice to recognize it instantly. Chen held a laptop, and his fingers moved across the keyboard with surgical precision. Dr. Hargrove attempted to have me delete security footage from the gas leak emergency, Chen said, his voice flat and clipped like a combat report. I'm prior service. I know what medical training looks like. I know the difference between panic and protocol. I saved every frame and contacted the FBI field office the same day. The split-screen footage played across the wall monitor, Megan performing the needle decompression with perfect technique, her hands moving like she'd done it 1,000 times under fire, because she had, while Hargrove watched from the hallway, his expression shifting from clinical interest to panic. Then the second feed, Hargrove in the security office, leaning over Chen's shoulder. Make it disappear. All of it. I'm protecting the hospital from liability. Timestamps. For phone calls to board members. Transcripts from the phone company, provided to federal investigators. A fabricated evidence packet planted in Megan's personnel file. The security director, handcuffed now, escorted past the nurses' station by uniformed officers. Hargrove tried to speak, his mouth opening like a fish gasping in drought. This is a misunderstanding. I was protecting the hospital. Commander Walsh's voice cut him off like a blade through silk. You tried to erase a decorated war hero to cover your fraud. We're done here. Federal agents moved with practiced efficiency, reading Hargrove his rights as they led him through the ER, past the residents who wouldn't meet his eyes, past the cafeteria where he'd knocked Megan's lunch tray to the floor 2 weeks ago, past the nurse's station where he'd bet $20 she'd quit within a week. The doors slid shut behind him. The ER exhaled. Megan stood motionless, her hand still on the trauma cart, and the graying patient, Khalid Omodi, former interpreter, survivor of the Kandahar compound evacuation, looked at her with eyes that held 18 years of gratitude. You gave my children their mother and father both, he whispered. You gave my family their lives. 6 months later, someone spotted Dr. Hargrove teaching CPR basics at a Norfolk community college for minimum wage, his medical license permanently revoked, his name attached to federal fraud convictions carrying a 12-year sentence and $2.3 million in restitution. The same week, Megan O'Brien stood in dress blues at a Navy ceremony honoring combat medical personnel, her son Danny beside her in his first suit, finally understanding the weight of the invisibility he'd carried his entire life. His mother was standing in formation with other sailors, her uniform pressed sharp as a blade, her silver star visible on her chest where it had always belonged. Commander Walsh presented her with a folded flag and read her commendations aloud to an audience of 200, the 12 Marines she'd saved in Kandahar, now healthy and standing in formation, saluting the woman who'd given them futures. The faded unit patch from her jacket lining hung framed in Sacred Heart's ER hallway with a bronze plaque reading, Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, USN, Silver Star Recipient, Gas Leak Emergency Response, 2024. Khalid Omodi attended the ceremony with his family, 3 children who existed because she'd refused to let him die. Danny asked his mother afterward if she wished she'd stayed invisible, stayed safe. Megan touched his face with the hands that had saved countless lives, and smiled. Some people are meant to save lives, sweetheart. Whether anyone's watching or not. The Navy SEAL whose tension pneumothorax she'd treated turned to his teammate and said quietly, "Told you that was combat technique." In the audience, the graying man nodded, his own gratitude finally visible in the light instead of buried in the dark. Megan walked back into Sacred Heart for her first shift as Director of Emergency Medicine, her dress blues replaced by scrubs, her existence no longer classified, no longer hidden. The quietest person in the room had become the one holding it all together, not in the shadows anymore, but standing where everyone could finally see. If you've made it this far, you know that sometimes the heroes walking among us don't wear capes. Sometimes they wear scrubs. Sometimes they save lives in the dark, and sometimes, when justice finally arrives, they get to step into the light. Subscribe for more stories about the invisible heroes living next to us. Like if you believe hidden strength deserves recognition. Comment below, would you have done what Megan did, or would you have protected yourself first?